In the summer of 1941, a United States Navy lieutenant commander named Jimmy Thach received an intelligence report that made him reach for a box of matches. The report described the Mitsubishi A6M0 in terms that were, to a professional aviator, alarming in the specific sense of a pilot reading performance specifications and understanding that the aircraft he would be flying against was superior to the aircraft he would be flying. In almost every category that mattered, the Zero climbed at approximately 4,000 feet per minute. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the aircraft Thach commanded, climbed at roughly 1,950 feet per minute. In aerial combat, the aircraft that climbs faster controls altitude. Altitude is potential energy. Height converted to speed, speed to position, position to the shot that ends the engagement. The Zero could outclimb the Wildcat by a factor of 2. The Zero's turn radius was smaller. In a turning fight, the aircraft that turns tighter wins. At low speeds, where turning fights were most intense, the Zero could turn inside virtually any Allied fighter in the Pacific. A Zero pilot who entered a slow-speed turning engagement with a Wildcat pilot had already won. The Zero weighed 5,555 pounds. The Wildcat weighed 7,426 pounds. Nearly 2,000 pounds lighter, with a smaller wing loading, the Zero achieved maneuverability that American test pilots described as phenomenal. The Wildcat had advantages. It was more rugged. Its self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor gave it survivability that Zero pilots would envy later in the war. In a steep dive, the two aircraft were roughly equal. But in Pacific aerial combat in 1941, at altitudes and speeds that favored turning fights, the Zero was not simply better than the Wildcat. It was better in the ways that decided aerial engagements. The institutional response to knowing this is to request better aircraft. The Navy did. The F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair were already in development, but development takes years. In 1941, Thach had Wildcats, and would have Wildcats for the foreseeable future, and the foreseeable future included a war with Japan. Thach was not a brilliant marksman or an aggressive ace. He was something rarer, a systematic thinker. He went home, sat at his kitchen table in Coronado, California, and reached for the matchbox. He needed to figure out how two inferior aircraft, flown by men with specific training, could defeat a superior aircraft flown by men with different training. Not eventually, in the next engagement. Not with better machines, with better thinking. The matchsticks represented aircraft. Each match was a fighter. The kitchen table was the sky. Thach had spent his career learning individual aerial combat skills, gunnery, evasion, using altitude and speed and sun position to gain advantage. He was good at these things, not, by his own assessment, extraordinary at them. What he was extraordinary at was the thing the institutional training of 1941 had not yet systematized, the geometry of two aircraft fighting together. The standard American fighter formation was the three-aircraft V, a lead plane and two wingmen in a triangle. It had been the standard for decades, the formation every air force in the world had converged on. It was also, Thach had begun to understand, deeply wrong. The V formation covered more sky visually, but in a turning fight, the wingmen flew so close to the lead aircraft they could not effectively watch for threats or contribute to the fight. They were followers, not fighters. The Zero did not fly in V formations. It flew in pairs. Thach began moving his matches. A superior aircraft attacking an inferior aircraft will, in a one-on-one engagement, almost always win. The superior aircraft chooses the terms. It attacks from altitude, closing the distance before the inferior aircraft can respond. It follows the inferior aircraft into a turn, and because its turn radius is smaller, closes the angle until it has a shot. If the inferior aircraft tries to disengage, the superior aircraft chooses to pursue or not. The inferior aircraft has no good option. What Thach had begun to understand, in the evenings at his kitchen table, was that the geometry changed with two inferior aircraft. The Zero attacks. The Wildcat flees. The Zero pursues. The Wildcat cannot escape. The Wildcat pilot dies. What if the Wildcat turned toward the Zero? The Zero pilot had three choices: break off the attack, accept a head-on pass, or follow the Wildcat through the turn. None were ideal. But a single Wildcat turning toward the Zero was not a trap. It was just a turn. The Zero pilot could follow through the turn and reacquire his position for the kill. Two Wildcats properly positioned were different. Thach's insight was what happened when they flew in parallel, separated by enough distance to matter. When the Zero attacked one of them, the attacked Wildcat turns toward the Zero. The Zero, pursuing, follows the turn. The second Wildcat also turns toward the first Wildcat. The two Wildcats are now converging, their paths crossing. The Zero, following the first Wildcat, is now on a collision course with the second Wildcat's guns. The Zero pilot must break off or be shot. If he breaks off the first Wildcat and turns to attack the second, the geometry repeats. The second Wildcat turns toward the Zero. The first Wildcat turns toward the second. The Zero finds itself, again, flying into the guns of the aircraft it is not pursuing. The trap. Attacking either Wildcat puts you in front of the other's guns. There is no attack angle from which a single Zero can kill one Wildcat without the other being positioned to kill the Zero. This is the Thach weave. Not defensive in the sense of running away. Defensive in the sense of making any offensive action against either aircraft suicidal for the attacker. The geometry works because the crossing paths create a coverage envelope that moves with the pair. Wherever they go, they cover each other's tails. An attacker following either aircraft into a turn will find the other aircraft pointing at him before completing the attack. Thach called it the beam defense position. The two aircraft defend each other's beams, the vulnerable sides a pursuing aircraft attacks from. James Flatley, who would fly alongside Thach in the Pacific, gave it the name that stuck. The name described what it looked like from outside: two aircraft weaving in and out of each other's paths in a pattern that appeared almost choreographed. From inside, it felt like something else. Security. Like knowing that every time you turned, the man behind you became visible to your wingman. Like fighting with someone watching the sky you couldn't see. What it accomplished: it made the Zero's superiority irrelevant. The Zero was better than the Wildcat in individual aerial combat. The Thach weave was not individual aerial combat. It was systematic teamwork with geometric precision, and in that, the Zero's individual superiority had no effective expression. Every attack angle produced a countershot. Every advantage the Zero pressed produced a disadvantage. The very aggressiveness that made the Zero deadly, the willingness to follow the target through its turns, to commit to the kill, became the mechanism by which the Wildcat's wingman got the shot. The aggressor becomes the target. The Matchsticks showed it working every time. The question was whether it would work in the air. Thach needed someone to play the Zero, to fly against the paired Wildcats with the aggression of a Japanese pilot, pressing every attack angle, looking for the gap. Ensign Edward Butch O'Hare was the best natural pilot in VF3. Where Thach was a systematic thinker, O'Hare was an intuitive one, a man whose hands knew what to do before his mind had decided. He would become the first naval aviator to receive the Medal of Honor in the Second World War for shooting down 5 Japanese bombers alone while protecting the carrier Lexington. If the Thach weave had a gap, O'Hare would find it. The test took place over San Diego in early 1942. Thach arranged it with the specific parameters of what he expected in combat: O'Hare flying alone as a Zero against 2 Wildcats executing the weave. The rules were simple. O'Hare would attack. If he could get a simulated killing shot on either Wildcat without exposing himself to a killing shot from the other, the weave had failed. O'Hare was the right man, aggressive. Not recklessly aggressive, he was a precision marksman, but a pilot who pressed every tactical opportunity, who would not break off an attack out of excessive caution, who would find and exploit every gap. He could not find the gap. Pass after pass from different attack angles, O'Hare found the same result. Every time he committed to an attack on one Wildcat, the other's nose swung toward him. Not randomly, systematically. A designed response, a geometric answer to the geometry of pursuit. After landing, O'Hare climbed out and walked over to where Thach was waiting. "Skipper," he said, "it really worked. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me. The matchsticks had been right. The geometry that worked on a kitchen table worked in the air over San Diego. An aggressive, talented pilot could not penetrate the coverage envelope two Wildcats created around themselves. The weave was not a trick that worked once, not an ambush requiring surprise. A systematic, tactical arrangement that created a geometrical problem for any attacker, regardless of skill or aggression. Thach had solved the zero not by inventing a better aircraft, not by training better marksmen, but by designing a formation that made individual aircraft performance largely irrelevant to the outcome of the engagement. The answer to the zero was not in the hangar. It was in the geometry of how two pilots flew together. This was a more fundamental insight than it appeared. The entire tradition of aerial combat was built around the individual pilot, the ace, the man whose skill and instincts in the cockpit produced kills. The measure of air power was individual pilot quality. Thach's insight undermined this tradition. He had demonstrated that two pilots of ordinary quality in a systematically inferior aircraft in a properly designed formation could neutralize a pilot of extraordinary quality flying a superior aircraft. The system was more powerful than the individual. This was not the lesson the aces wanted to hear. It was the lesson that was true. It was the lesson the Matchsticks had demonstrated, that O'Hare had confirmed, and that the Battle of Midway would prove at the cost that proofs in combat always carry. But first, Thach had to get the Navy to adopt it. The institutional reception was not enthusiastic. Senior officers who had built their careers on individual pilot excellence were not eager to be told that a lieutenant commander had solved the problem with a box of matches. The existing doctrine represented decades of accumulated institutional wisdom. Thach's rank was not high enough to simply order the change. His idea was good enough to argue for it, and the intelligence reports were frightening enough that senior officers listened. The Navy adopted the paired formation. Not uniformly, not immediately, not with the enthusiasm that combat necessity would eventually produce, but adopted it. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The war Thach had been preparing for had begun. In the first weeks of the Pacific War, the intelligence reports were confirmed. 0 pilots shot down American aircraft at ratios the Navy had feared but hoped were exaggerated. They were not. American pilots in V formations against zeros in pairs were encountering exactly the problem the intelligence had predicted. Thach's weave was the answer for pilots who knew it, had practiced it, and could execute it under actual combat conditions, nothing like the exercises over San Diego. The Battle of Midway would determine whether the geometry that worked with matchsticks on a kitchen table worked when the zeros were real, the guns were loaded, and the ocean was 1,000 feet below. June 4th, 1942, 700 hours. The aircraft carrier Yorktown turns into the wind. Thach leads 6 F-4 Wildcats off the deck to escort 12 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers toward the Japanese fleet. The Devastators are slow, 132 miles per hour at best, heading toward 4 fleet carriers, dozens of escort vessels, and a combat air patrol of zeros that has been decimating every American attack for the past 2 hours. Thach is flying with pilots who have practiced the weave but never tested it in combat. His wingman is Ensign Robert Ram Dibb. Lieutenant Brainerd McCumber's radio is already malfunctioning. He will not be able to hear Thach's instructions during the engagement. Approaching the Japanese fleet, the Zeros attack. 15 to 20 of them, possibly more. They dove from altitude in the coordinated pairs that Japanese training had made standard, looking for the vulnerable bellies of the Devastators below. In their first pass, 1 Wildcat is immediately set ablaze. It goes down. 5 remain. McCumber, his radio out, cannot execute the coordinated weave. He fights alone, trying to keep zeros off the Devastators by himself. Thach, with Dibb on his wing, initiates the weave. What happened is documented in Thach's own after-action report, written on the evening of June 4th. He wrote, "It is indeed surprising that any of our pilots returned alive." He wrote that the only success the Wildcats achieved against the Zero was the result of comparatively poor marksmanship of the Japanese, stupid mistakes made by a few of their pilots, and superior marksmanship and teamwork of some of our pilots. The only way we can ever bring our guns to bear on the Zero fighter is to trick them into recovering in front of an F4F. This is the Thach weave in a single line. The Zero is not beaten in a turning fight. It is tricked into the turning fight's geometry becoming disadvantageous. The Zero pilot follows his target through the turn and finds the other Wildcat's guns. Thach shot down 3 Zeros at Midway. His surviving pilots accounted for more. The VF-3 pilots who executed the weave, outnumbered 3 or 4 to 1, emerged with a kill ratio the pre-war doctrine would have considered impossible. But the Devastators were slaughtered. 5 of the 12 returned. The weave had protected Thach's section. It had not protected the torpedo bombers, because the Zeros that attacked the Wildcats were separate from the Zeros that attacked the Devastators. Thach's report did not claim victory. It claimed that the tactic worked under the conditions in which he could apply it, that the conditions had been desperate, and that better aircraft were urgently needed. He was honest about what the weave had and had not achieved. What it had achieved, 4 Wildcats against 15 or 20 Zeros had survived long enough to shoot down multiple enemy aircraft. Without the weave, 4 Wildcats against 15 Zeros would have been 4 burning aircraft in the Pacific Ocean within 3 minutes. The geometry that worked on the kitchen table had worked in the air over the Japanese fleet. The Matchsticks had been right. Word spread through the Pacific Fleet within days, not through official channels, but through the network of pilots who had heard from other pilots that Thach's section had survived a 15-4 engagement using a maneuver nobody had tried in combat before. The Thach weave was adopted not because the institution ordered it. It was adopted because it worked. And in combat, things that work spread faster than doctrine. By the battles of the Solomon Islands later in 1942, the weave was standard practice across Navy and Marine Corps fighter squadrons. The V formation, the standard of decades, was abandoned so completely that within a year, few American naval aviators remembered using it. A lieutenant commander with a box of matches had replaced 30 years of fighter aviation doctrine. Because he had been right about the geometry, the Thach weave worked because it addressed a problem at the right level. The problem of the Zero was not a problem of aircraft performance. It was a problem of geometry. And geometry, unlike aircraft performance, does not care which aircraft is faster, or which climbs better, or which turns tighter. Geometry is neutral. It operates on the positions of aircraft in space relative to each other. And if those positions can be arranged correctly, the specific performance characteristics of the aircraft occupying them become secondary. This distinction between solving a problem at the level of the tool and solving it at the level of the system is one that military history has produced many examples of, and that military institutions consistently struggle to recognize because institutions are organized to improve their tools rather than to redesign the systems in which tools operate. The United States Army Air Force's response to the Zero was to build better aircraft. The F-6F Hellcat entered service in 1943 and outperformed the Zero in nearly every category. The F-4U Corsair was faster than the Zero and more heavily armed. Both were superior to the Zero in 1943 and 1944. The aircraft solution eventually worked. It took 2 years. In those 2 years, the Thach weave kept pilots alive who would otherwise have died. The institutional arithmetic was not computed at the time. How many American pilots survived 1942 because they flew in pairs, rather than in the V formation that would have gotten them killed? The numbers are not separable from the larger dataset in precise ways that allow the specific contribution of the tactic to be isolated. But the qualitative evidence is consistent. Pilots who flew the weave reported that it changed the engagement against the Zero from a desperate individual survival problem to a manageable tactical problem. Not easy, not safe, manageable. Before the weave, a Wildcat pilot seeing a Zero on his tail was, in most circumstances, dead. The Zero would close the angle, get the shot, and the Wildcat pilot's options for survival were limited. After the weave, a Wildcat pilot seeing a Zero on his tail turned toward his wingman. The turning was not evasion, it was the initiation of the trap. The Zero, following the turn, flew into the guns of the second Wildcat. The pilot who had been the target became the cover, and the pilot who had been cover became the shot. The psychological effect was as significant as the tactical one. Fighter pilots who believe they can be killed by the aircraft they are assigned to fight are operating under a burden that degrades their performance. They fly more defensively. They take fewer risks. They use their aircraft's capabilities less effectively because the primary calculation is survival rather than kill. The Weave gave the Wildcat pilot something that no amount of training and individual combat skills could have given him. It gave him a system that could win. Not a system that guaranteed survival. Midway had demonstrated that. But a system that made survival and success possible in conditions where, individually, neither was. Thach understood this. His after-action report from Midway was not triumphalist. He knew that the Weave had worked and that better aircraft were still needed. He knew that the tactic addressed the geometry of the problem and that the problem also had a performance dimension the tactic could not fully solve. He was right about both. The Weave was the tactical solution. The Hellcat was the strategic one. Together, they ended the Zero's dominance over the Pacific sky. The Japanese Zero pilots who encountered the Thach Weave for the first time at Midway did not understand what they were seeing. The maneuver was genuinely new. Nothing in the training Japanese fighter pilots had received, nothing in the combat experience they had accumulated in China, nothing in the doctrine that had made them the most effective naval aviators in the Pacific prepared them for the specific problem the Weave presented. Japanese Zero pilots had been trained for the turning fight, to exploit the Zero's superior maneuverability in exactly the way the aircraft's design facilitated. Get on the tail, follow the target through the turn, close the angle, take the shot. This was the correct doctrine for the Zero against the Wildcat in individual combat. Against the Thach Weave, it was exactly wrong. The pilot who got on a Wildcat's tail and followed it through the turn found, at the moment when his shot should have been available, that the other Wildcat's nose was pointed at him. The correct counter was to break off the attack before committing to the turn, recognize that the geometry had made pursuit fatal, and disengage. Some experienced Zero pilots figured this out and broke off. When they did, the Weave had still succeeded. The Zero had not gotten the shot, the Wildcat had survived. But many Zero pilots followed the target through the turn anyway. They had done it successfully hundreds of times. The instinct to press the attack, to commit, to close, to fire, was deeply trained. And in the geometry of the Thach Weave, that instinct produced the same result every time: the wingman's guns. This is the paradox Thach had designed from the kitchen table in Coronado. The Zero's greatest tactical strength, its aggressive pressing style, the willingness of its pilots to commit to the kill, was the mechanism by which the Weave worked. A cautious Zero pilot who broke off at the first sign of the crossing geometry was less dangerous in the short term, but more difficult to kill. An aggressive Zero pilot who pressed the advantage was more deadly in the first moments, but more reliably guided into the trap. Thach had turned the Zero's excellence against it, not by finding a weakness in the aircraft, by finding a weakness in the doctrine the aircraft's excellence had produced. The Zero was so good its pilots had learned to trust their aggressiveness. That trust, in the geometry of the Thach Weave, became lethal. The doctrine that makes a force formidable contains the vulnerability that a creative opponent can exploit. The Zero's aggressiveness made it vulnerable to a trap that used aggressiveness as the trigger. Thach had read the intelligence report and asked, "What does this aircraft's excellence require of its pilots, and how do we use that requirement against them?" The training that had made Japanese Zero pilots the most formidable aerial warriors in the Pacific also made them susceptible to a trap that exploited that aggression. After Midway, Japanese fighter pilots developed counters, tactical adjustments that made the maneuver less consistently effective against experienced pilots who recognized it. This is the nature of tactical innovation. Each innovation provokes a counter. The Thach Weave was not the end of the tactical evolution of Pacific air combat. Its value was greatest in the period before the Japanese pilots developed effective counters, and before American aircraft improved enough to give pilots better options. That period lasted approximately 2 years. 2 years of Wildcat pilots who survived because of matchsticks on a kitchen table. After Thach's tactical genius was recognized at Midway, the Navy transferred him away from combat. He was too valuable to risk at sea. He went to Jacksonville, Florida, to teach combat tactics and produce training films. His geometry was more valuable to the Navy than his flying. He spent the rest of 1942 and 1943 teaching. The pilots he taught took the weave to every theater of the Pacific. Over Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Marianas, each time a Wildcat, and later a Hellcat, and later a Corsair, turned toward its wingman with a zero on its tail, the geometry that had started on a kitchen table in Coronado expressed itself again. The geometry was right. The timing was everything. Jimmy Thach spent the middle years of the war in a classroom in Jacksonville, Florida. Thach had demonstrated at Midway that his tactical thinking was worth more than his flying. The Navy needed pilots who could execute the weave. It needed only one person who could teach it to hundreds, who would teach it to thousands more. Removing him from combat was the kind of resource allocation decision that militaries are supposed to make and rarely do. He was displeased about it. He wanted to be in the Pacific. He was a pilot, not a teacher. He was wrong about this, or at least the Navy was right about the arithmetic, even if Thach was right about his own preferences. The training films he produced became the standard against which every Navy and Marine Corps fighter pilot was trained for the next 2 years. The films made explicit what the Matchsticks had demonstrated: the geometry of the maneuver, the specific positions that created the coverage envelope, the timing of the turns that kept the two aircraft coordinated. Pilots who could not be there to practice with Thach personally learned the geometry in Jacksonville, then took it to their squadrons, then to the Pacific. The knowledge replicated itself through the institutional structure of flight training with a speed that formal doctrine changes rarely achieved. A pilot who watched the films understood something no amount of individual gunnery training could provide: the precise relationship between his aircraft and his wingmen that made them more than the sum of their parts. Two inferior aircraft in the right geometric relationship defeat a superior aircraft. This was the lesson. The training films disseminated it to every carrier squadron in the Pacific, not as doctrine, but as operational knowledge that pilots absorbed because it kept them alive. In late 1943 and 1944, as the Hellcat and Corsair gave American pilots aircraft that could fight the Zero on more equal terms, the weave became less necessary for survival. A Hellcat pilot who lost a turning fight still had the option of diving away at speeds the Zero could not match, an option the Wildcat had never reliably had. But the weave did not disappear. It evolved. The principle that had made it effective: two aircraft covering each other's tails, creating a mutual defense that no single attacker could penetrate, was not dependent on the specific performance characteristics that had made it necessary. It was a general principle of aerial combat teamwork, applicable whenever one aircraft had an attacker on its tail and a wingman in position to help. With the Hellcat, the weave became offensive as well as defensive. Two Hellcats executing the crossing maneuver against a Zero could create shot opportunities. The faster Hellcat could use the weave's geometry to position itself for attacks that the Zero, focused on the bait aircraft, did not anticipate. The tool invented for survival became a tool for dominance. This is the mark of a genuinely powerful tactical innovation. It works in the conditions that produced it, and continues to work in different conditions because the underlying principle remains valid even when the specific context changes. The weave that Thach designed for a Wildcat against a Zero worked for a Hellcat against a Zero, and later for an F-9F Panther against a MiG-15 in Korea, and later still for an F-4 Phantom against a MiG-21 in Vietnam. Different aircraft, different enemies, same geometry. Thach had not invented a tactic for a specific war. He had discovered a principle. Principles, unlike tactics, do not become obsolete. The matchsticks on the kitchen table in Coronado had revealed one: never fight alone. Never give an attacker the geometry of the individual pursuit. Always make the aggressor the target. The geometry was right. It was still right in Korea, in Vietnam, in every war where pilots flew in pairs and one turned toward his wingman when the threat appeared behind him. In 1968, the United States Navy had a problem that sounded familiar. Its F-4 Phantom II fighters were trading kills with MiG-21s at a nearly 1-to-1 ratio. The worst air-to-air combat performance in American history. An aircraft that by any technical measure should have dominated the sky was instead struggling against an opponent that was smaller, lighter, less powerful, and considerably less expensive. The problem was not the aircraft. The F-4 was faster than the MiG-21. It could carry more weapons. It had radar that could detect targets beyond visual range. It was, in the conventional metrics of 1960s air power analysis, a superior aircraft. It was also heavier, less maneuverable at close range, and flown by pilots whose training had been built around the assumption that the age of the dogfight was over. Missiles had made close-range air combat obsolete. The F-4 was designed to intercept bombers at long range. Its pilots were trained to fire missiles and disengage. The MiG-21 pilots of the North Vietnamese Air Force were trained to force the engagement close, inside the minimum arming distance of the Sparrow missiles that were the F-4's primary weapon, into the turning fight that the Phantom was not designed to win. The Americans had encountered this problem before. In 1941, the problem had been the Zero. The answer had been a lieutenant commander with matchsticks on a kitchen table. In 1968, the problem was the MiG-21. The answer was the Navy Fighter Weapons School. The institutional pattern was identical: a capable aircraft failing against a smaller, more agile opponent. Pilots trained for the wrong kind of fight. Doctrine that had not kept pace with what the enemy was doing. And somewhere in the institution, the knowledge that tactics, not technology, were the gap that needed to be closed. Established in March 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar, Top Gun was, at its core, a school for teaching aerial combat tactics, not missile employment. The close-range maneuvering fight that institutional doctrine had declared obsolete, and that the MiGs were demonstrating, was very much alive. The curriculum included the principles Thach had developed in 1941. The loose deuce, the two-aircraft formation the Navy evolved from the Thach weave for the jet age, placed two aircraft flying about a mile apart, each covering the other's tail, each able to become either the lead attacker or the covering wingman, depending on the developing geometry of the engagement. The Thach weave had evolved. The principle had not. Two aircraft covering each other's tails, creating a mutual defense that no single attacker could penetrate without exposing himself to the other aircraft's guns. Different speeds, different weapons, different altitudes. The geometry was the same. Top Gun graduates went back to their squadrons and flew the 1972 linebacker campaigns. Navy pilots achieved kill ratios of 13-1. Air Force pilots, whose service had focused on technological upgrades rather than training, achieved ratios of approximately 2-1. Training worked. The geometry worked. The lesson from 1941 was still the lesson in 1972. The institutional problem. In 1941, in 1968, in every era when a new aircraft performance gap created a crisis, was the same. The institution assumed that the aircraft was the answer. Build a better aircraft, and the tactical problems would resolve themselves. Sometimes they did. The Hellcat was better than the Zero. But building a better aircraft took years, and in the years before the better aircraft arrived, pilots needed something that could work with the aircraft they had. The Thach weave was that something in 1942. Top Gun was that something in 1969. Both were answers to the same question. How do you win when your aircraft is not better than your opponent's? The answer, in both cases, was not the aircraft. It was the geometry of how you flew it with someone else. Jimmy Thach returned to combat in 1944. The Navy had kept him in Jacksonville for 2 years. He had produced the training films, taught the tactics, sent hundreds of pilots back to the Pacific with the geometry in their heads. The institutional transmission had worked. The Thach weave was no longer one man's insight applied by one squadron in one battle. It was the standard practice of every fighter squadron in the United States Navy. He went back as operations officer for Vice Admiral John McCain's Fast Carrier Task Force. He was present on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, when Japan surrendered. He was 40 years old. He had spent the war solving problems. The first problem: how do you fly an inferior aircraft against a superior one and survive? Never alone. In pairs, in the geometric arrangement that made every attack on one aircraft a danger to the attacker from the other. The second problem: how do you transmit a tactical insight to thousands of pilots across thousands of miles? Training films, classroom instruction, the systematic conversion of geometric insight into teachable procedure, and the institutional will to prioritize that transmission. The third problem, the one that would only become clear in retrospect, was the hardest. How do you prevent an institution from forgetting what it learned? In the 20 years between the Second World War and Vietnam, the United States Navy largely forgot the Thach weave. The institutional emphasis on missile technology and beyond visual range combat had displaced the close-in maneuvering tactics the weave represented. The F-4 Phantom was designed to fight at long range. Its pilots were trained accordingly. The MiGs forced the Navy back to the lessons of 1941. Top Gun, the institutional response to the MiG problem in 1969, was, in its essential structure, the same solution Thach had applied in 1942. Systematic training in the geometry of aerial combat, transmitted through an institutional structure that could replicate the knowledge across the force. The lesson had to be learned twice. Military institutions consistently discover the same tactical principles, forget them in peace, and rediscover them when the next war forces the confrontation again. The specific weapons change, the aircraft change. The geometry of two aircraft covering each other's tails does not change. Thach had found a principle, not specific to the Wildcat or the Zero or the Pacific in 1942, specific to the geometry of aerial combat in the presence of a determined attacker with superior maneuverability. That geometry exists wherever those conditions exist. The conditions have not stopped existing. John Thach retired from the Navy in 1967 as a full admiral. He lived to see Top Gun established, the principles he had developed with Matchsticks validated again in Vietnam, the loose deuce become the standard formation of American naval aviation. He died in 1981, at the age of 75, in Coronado, California, the same town where the Matchsticks had been on the kitchen table in 1941. The loose deuce, the bracket, the modern two-ship tactical formations that every Air Force in the world trains its fighter pilots in. Each contains, at its core, the insight that Thach formalized in 1941. Two aircraft in the right geometric relationship are more than twice as effective as one. Not because two aircraft have twice the weapons or twice the engines, because two aircraft have no blind spot. The aircraft on your tail is visible to your wingman. The aircraft pursuing your wingman is visible to you. The mutual coverage of the pair creates a defended space that no single attacker can penetrate without exposing himself. Aerial combat has changed enormously in range, weapons, speed, radar, and electronic warfare. But in the specific geometry of the close-in maneuvering fight, when one aircraft is pursuing another, and the question is whether the pursuer can be killed before he kills the target, the answer Thach found with Matchsticks on a kitchen table in Coronado is still the answer. Never fight alone. The man behind you is behind your wingman's guns. The Matchsticks are still on the table. Not literally. The kitchen table in Coronado is gone, the house is gone, Thach is gone. But the specific insight that the Matchsticks produced, the geometric relationship between two aircraft that makes each the other's defense, is present in the formation doctrine of every Air Force in the world that takes aerial combat seriously. The F-35 pilots who fly combat air patrols today fly in pairs, not because some regulation requires it, because the geometry that Thach discovered in 1941 with Matchsticks continues to be the most effective answer to the problem of a determined attacker. The F-22, the Su-57, the Eurofighter. Every fourth and fifth generation fighter aircraft in the world is trained to fly the formation that Thach formalized. The names have changed: tactical wing, fluid four, loose deuce, but the geometry is the same. This is the rarest kind of military innovation. Not the innovation that is superseded when the technology changes, the tank that made the cavalry charge obsolete, the precision-guided bomb that made the dive bomber obsolete. Those innovations are tied to specific technological conditions. When the conditions change, the innovation becomes history. The Thach weave is not tied to specific technological conditions. It is tied to the geometry of pursuit. And the geometry of pursuit has not changed since 1941 and will not change until aerial combat ceases to involve one aircraft chasing another through three-dimensional space. It has not ceased. It will not cease. This is why the Thach weave is still taught at every flight school that teaches air combat maneuvering, not as history, as current doctrine. USS Thach, a guided missile frigate, was named for him in 1984. He did not live to see it commissioned. He had died 3 years earlier. He had been, by the assessment of historians who have studied the Pacific Air War, one of the most significant tactical thinkers of the 20th century. Not the most famous, Thach was never a public figure in the way the aces were, never the name on recruiting posters or in newsreel narration. He was the man with the matchsticks, the systematic thinker who worked at night and tested his ideas in the air and taught what he had found to thousands of men who flew into combat and came home. The Zero was faster. The Zero climbed better. The Zero turned tighter. Thach solved it with matchsticks on a kitchen table. The answer was not a better airplane. The answer was never fight alone. This is the lesson that the Pacific Air War produced and that Vietnam confirmed, and that every subsequent generation of fighter pilots has had to relearn. Never fight alone. The man behind you is behind your wingman's guns. This was the geometry of 1941. It is the geometry of today. It will be the geometry of whatever comes next. The geometry does not care which aircraft is faster. It does not care which climbs better or turns tighter. It cares about position, about the specific relationship between two aircraft that creates a space the attacker cannot enter without becoming the target. Two aircraft, properly positioned, have no blind spot. One aircraft always does. This was the problem Thach saw in the intelligence report in 1941. He did not ask for a better Wildcat. He asked, how do we make the one-on-one fight not happen? The answer was the formation that made every attack on one aircraft an attack into the guns of another. The answer was never alone. It was still the answer at Midway, still the answer over North Vietnam, still the answer in every Air Force doctrine that puts two aircraft in the sky together and trains them to turn toward each other when the threat appears behind one of them. The matchsticks showed it first, on a kitchen table in Coronado in 1941. They were right.